Und wenn man denkt, halt, jetzt hast du das gemacht, dann viel genug Arbeit. Ja, muss man immer schaffen, bis man gleich wieder umfällt, dann kann man aufhören.
Hi, my name is Bob Ell. That was my grandmother, Catherine Ell, who was born in Russia in 1891. What you're about to see is the history of our remarkable family and how John and Catherine raised 13 children on the Canadian prairies. Our story begins with the birth of Matthias Ell in 1690 in the little town of Dermersheim in southern Germany near the Rhine River. The town of Dermersheim dates back to the 6th century, and Matthias' ancestors had probably lived here for generations. This house was built in 1733, and this is the Dermersheim Town Hall in 1749. Some of the towns surrounding Dermersheim were Rastatt, Kronau, and Speyer. For more than a century after Matthias was born, all of his children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren grew up in Dermersheim. But in the late 1700s and in the early part of the 1800s, events were to happen that changed the lives of Matthias' family forever. In the late 1700s and early 1800s, Central Europe was in turmoil, caused by Napoleon's military campaigns. And in 1806, the area around Dermersheim came under the rule of Karl Friedrich, who the people considered was a mere servant of Napoleon. The people bitterly resented Karl Friedrich's increase in taxation, and particularly the ruthless recruiting of their young men for service in Napoleon's military campaigns. There was also grievous complaints about the increase in food prices, the stagnation of trade, the low returns on agricultural products and services, and the scarcity of money. Just 2 years before Karl Friedrich came to power, Tsar Alexander I of Russia had published a manifesto in which he extended a generous invitation to foreigners, particularly Germans, to settle on the Virgin Steppes near Odessa, Russia. The Tsar's manifesto offered transportation to Russia, religious and political freedom, and land. The promise of free land and assurance of wonderful freedoms tugged at the people's dreams, and in 1809, Matthias' great-grandson Jacob and 34 other families from Dermersheim decided to immigrate to Russia. Jacob, a tailor, was 29 years old. His wife Margaretha was 24, and their son Thomas was 3. It was a sad time in Dermersheim as Jacob and Margaretha and the other families began their trek to Russia. In the mind of the villagers, immigration was akin to a funeral. The wagon train of departing immigrants was accompanied some distance beyond the village by a procession of sympathetic relatives and friends who bade a last tearful farewell, for they realized that they would likely never see them again. The collecting point was Ulm on the Danube River, from where transportation by boat and wagon were provided by the Tsar. The trip by boat from Ulm to Vienna took 10 days. Then from Vienna the immigrant caravans went overland to the Russian border city of Radzivilov. At Radzivilov, the immigrants had to spend 4 weeks in quarantine. This proved to be almost more wearisome and monotonous than the long trek. The quarters assigned to them were crowded, crude, and uncomfortable. The food was bad and the living conditions quite unsanitary. After the expiration of the quarantine, the Russian commissars organized new wagon trains, and they now began a 4-week trek through the vast steppe land that stretched all the way to the Black Sea. The immigrants had encountered many hardships on their long eastward trek, but after a tedious 4-month journey, their caravan reached Odessa in late 1809. They had covered some 1,200 miles. In the spring of 1810, the colony of Rastatt was established in the Berezin district north of Odessa, and by January 1, 1811, 100 families numbering 470 souls were settled in Rastatt. One of the founding families was headed by Jacob Ell from Dermersheim, Germany. Each family was given a plot within the colony for their home and barn. The farmland outside the colony was divided up also, so that each farmer had land close to the colony as well as land further away. The most important task was to build an adequate dwelling for each family. Since timber, brick, and stone was not available in the steppe, they built adobe huts constructed of sun-dried clay blocks. Keeping these adobe huts warm in winter was very difficult, as the only available fuel was dried cow dung and reeds that they hauled home from the marshes. These are adobe blocks drying in the sun, and off to the right are stacked manure slabs for winter fuel. The huts were only some 12 by 16 feet and had only 2 rooms. The floor was simply the natural layer of hard-packed clay soil on which grass was sprinkled to keep the dust down. Tallow candles furnished the only source of light during the long winter evenings. The villagers immediately set about planting crops and gathering winter hay for the livestock. To break the sod, 6 oxen or 4 horses had to be hitched to the plow, and in summer the soil became so hard it cracked. A typhoid epidemic caused by polluted water broke out in Rastatt in October of 1811. It took the lives of over 150 people. Many of the pioneer settlers found the hardships and deprivations of frontier life so frightful and oppressive that they chose to flee back to their native villages in Germany. But once the colony was established, schools and churches were built. The German language was spoken in Russia. It was used in schools, in church, and in everyday life. While the Germans and Russians didn't mix socially and almost never intermarried, the cultures combined through language, clothing, cooking, and farming. The food that the German Russians prepared was unique. It had both German and Russian influences and included knepla, small bits of dough in a soup, sauerkraut, different sausages flavored with garlic, and halupsi, which are cabbage rolls. The German Russians were strong farmers and assisted in developing wheat to grow in the areas in which they were settled. Harvest for many years was done by cutting the crop down with a scythe and hand-tying the stalks into large bundles. These were then hauled home, where they were thrashed by using horses hitched to the thrashing stone. As technology advanced, the Germans advanced along with it. They mastered the techniques of farming, and many Russian workers would hire on with the German farmers just to learn the method of their farming. Over the years, the German settlers became model farmers, and many Russians followed their examples. By 1860, the German colonies had conquered the steppe and had entered a period of expanding prosperity. But the 1870s marked a change in the status of the German people in Russia. The emigration of the Germans from Russia to the Americas began in the early 1870s, when Alexander II revoked the privileges offered to the Germans who had settled in Russia more than a century earlier. There was also a growing sentiment of hostility towards foreigners, particularly Germans, and a policy of Russification was adopted to make the populations in the empire more Russian. As conditions deteriorated for the Germans in Russia, North America became the new promised land. Canada and the United States were now publishing their own invitations for settlers, and thousands of Germans left Russia to seek land and freedom in the Americas. Even though the village of Rastatt had been home to Jacob Ell's family for 80 years, in 1890 Jacob's grandson Vincent and his family decided to emigrate to Canada. The Germans that stayed in Russia had to face a terrible fate. Many never survived the Bolshevik Revolution and were massacred without mercy. In the beginning of the 1890s, greater numbers of immigrants left the Beresen district that consisted of 6 Catholic villages: Rastatt, München, Karlsruhe, Katharinenthal, Landau, Speyer, and Sulz. In 1890, 2 of Vincent and Teresa's children, Johannes and Anna Maria, left for Canada with their spouses and children. Then in 1899, Vincent and Teresa, along with their sons Adam and Ignaz, and their spouses and children, left Rastatt to join Johannes and Anna Maria in Canada. Vincent and his family had sold everything but what they wanted to take along on a journey. After traveling to Odessa, they took a train from there to Antwerp, Belgium, where they bought a fare to New York on the steamship Friesland. It was the age of steam, and both the locomotive and the ship were steam-driven. This was the ship that Vincent and his family sailed on from Antwerp to New York in 1899. The trip across the Atlantic lasted almost 2 weeks, and the conditions of travel were awful at best. But the youngsters were amazed by the size of the ship and the vastness of the ocean. As most of the passengers had little money, they were only able to afford passage in the steerage. This was down inside the ship with little light and no fresh air. The smell of unwashed people and vomit permeated the air. There was little to eat, and many times what was there had spoiled. As the Friesland steamed across the Atlantic to New York, the passengers would climb to the deck whenever the weather would allow. Death at sea was feared, but many people received a burial at sea. This is a copy of the ship's manifest from the Friesland. The manifest lists 12 passengers with the name Ell. Vincent Ell, age 72, his wife Teresa, aged 69, Vincent's son Ignaz Ell, age 34, his wife Agath, age 29, their children Sebastian, age 9, Maria Anna, age 6, and Emily, age 1, and Adam Ell, age 44, his wife Maria, age 35, their children Ignaz, age 14, Johannes, age 9, and Rosa Maria, age 6 months. This close-up of the manifest shows the names of Adam, his wife, and 3 of their children. 9-year-old Johannes Ell would grow up to be my grandfather John. As their ship entered the New York harbor, John and his family were amazed at the sight of the Statue of Liberty. The statue had been completed only 13 years earlier. The Friesland arrived in New York on May 2nd of 1899 and docked at the Ellis Island Immigration Station near the Statue of Liberty. After the immigrants disembarked from the ship, the U.S. Customs agents inspected everyone for disease. Those that did not pass the exam were either admitted into hospital or put back on the ship and sent back to Europe. From New York, young John and his family took a long train ride to Winnipeg, where they were to meet his uncle Johannes. 9-year-old John was looking forward to getting to Winnipeg, as he had never met his uncle Johannes or his aunt Anna Maria, as they had emigrated to Canada the year John was born. In 1890, 9 years before his father and brothers, Johannes and his family had arrived in Canada with a group of immigrants from Rastatt, Russia. While Johannes and 2 other newcomers went to Belgony with another agent, their families had stayed in Winnipeg for 10 days with an immigration officer. The settlement of St. Joseph Colony near Belgony had been established some years previously, and one of the settlers had driven the newcomers south to the place where 14 Colony is presently located. After returning to Winnipeg from their inspection tour, Johannes and the others had purchased provisions and the necessary household utensils and implements. The Canadian Pacific Railway had put 2 rail cars at their disposal, and on the 6th of June 1890 they arrived in Belgony. The next day, 8 of the newcomers had gone to Regina to apply for homesteads. They had been told that according to Canada's Dominion Lands Act of 1872, every immigrant could obtain for $10 a 160-acre homestead in the West, which became his property after 3 years if certain conditions were met. While in Regina, they had purchased oxen and wagons, and then driven a bit north into the bush and got a load of poplar trees for their buildings, and then returned to the northeast corner of Section 14 where they pitched their tents. The immigrants had previously lived in colonies in Russia, and they could not accept the solitude and the distance from one another on the wide open prairies, and eventually they established 5 colonies east of Regina. St. Joseph Colony, St. Mary's Colony, St. Peter's Colony, later to be called Catherine Tall Colony or 14 Colony, Rastatt Colony, also called 7 Colony, and Spire Colony. The establishment of these colonies is historically unique in the settlement of the Canadian prairies. No other residential hamlets in Western Canada or on the plains of the United States were founded by individual farmers. Johannes' family, along with 20 other families, had established 14 Colony on a quarter section of land they bought from a pioneer for $150. It had been divided into lots and 21 families settled there. Among the first proprietors were 3 of Vincent Ell's sons, Johannes, Adam, and Ignaz. As the most pressing need had been to provide a good, warm, and safe shelter, 8 families had built 4 houses. Johannes and his brother-in-law, Johannes Bast, built a house together. The settlers had used sun-dried clay blocks to build their houses, just as their forefathers had in Russia. It was a very happy reunion in Winnipeg in May of 1899, when Johannes met his family that he had not seen for 9 years. After completing the Canadian immigration requirements, they took the train to Belgony in the district of Assiniboia. 6 years later, in 1905, the provinces of Alberta and Saskatchewan were created. They arrived at Belgony in May of 1899 and then drove south a few miles by horse-drawn wagon to their new home in 14 Colony. It was an exciting time for young John as he got to know his new home and the aunts, uncles, and cousins he had never met. 3 years after the family arrived in 14 Colony, John's sister Teresa was born. In 1905, 14-year-old Catherine Ressler came to 14 Colony with her parents Joseph and Veronica and her brothers and sisters. When her parents moved to Prelate, Catherine remained in the colony doing housekeeping for others and working in the fields. As it was not considered necessary for a girl to go to school, Catherine did not learn how to read or write. She only spoke German, but in a short time she understood English quite well. This is a photo of Catherine's maternal grandparents. Their last name was Mathian. In 1910, John's grandfather Vincent passed away. May he rest in peace. I was not able to determine when John's grandmother Teresa passed away. John and Catherine's families had lived in the same areas of Germany and Russia for generations, and so they would have had a lot in common. I was told that John was a shy boy, but on July 3rd of 1911, John and Catherine Ressler were married in St. Peter's Church at 7 Colony. The new couple moved in with John's family. John was 21 and Catherine was 20. The provincial legislative building was completed in 1912. That same year, a tornado swept through Regina, destroying much of the city, but the ravaged areas were quickly rebuilt. In April of 1912, John and Catherine's first child was born in their mud house in 14 Colony. They named him Ignace, and in May of 1913, Rosemary was born. In the summer of 1914, John arranged for a photographer to take this portrait of their little family. John was 24, Catherine was 23, little Ignace was 2, and baby Rosie was 1. Little Ignace would grow up to be my father. As the years went by, John and Catherine's little family grew. In April of 1915, Anna Mary was born, Anne was born in April of 1917, and Peter was born in May of 1919. Paul was born in May of 1921, when Catherine was 30 years old, and Frank was born in May of 1923. Veronica was born in May of 1925, Adam arrived in February of 1927, and Joe in January of 1929. Andrew was born in January of 1931, and Emma was born in September of 1933. John and Catherine's 13th and last child was born in May of 1935. They named him John. John was 45 and Catherine was 44. In 1914, war broke out in Europe. After the war, the demand for wheat dropped. In 1929, the stock market crashed and the price of wheat fell even further during the Great Depression of the 1930s. Low wheat prices were not the only cause of hardship. A drought that lasted 8 years added to the misery. This was a desperate time for the people of the prairies. Prosperity did not return to the prairies until 1939. In the early days, the washing was done on the washboard by rubbing up and down using homemade lye soap. Clothes were line dried even in winter. In cold weather, the clothes would freeze stiff as a board but would dry okay. This method was called freeze dry, and white clothes would get really nice and white as a result. Catherine washed clothes and diapers in a wash tub using a washboard and hung clothes outside to dry in summer and winter. My dad liked to tell the story of how his grandfather Adam had taught him how to polish his shoes with the black soot from the wood-burning cook stove, and how to clean the barn. Adam had been a great help to Catherine when her children were young. Adam's wife Mariana passed away in December of 1917 at the age of 57. In 1931, Adam passed away at the age of 73. This is how wells were dug in pioneer times. Refrigerators were unheard of. To keep milk, cream, butter, and meat cool, they were put into a pail and lowered by rope into the well and hung there until mealtime. Later on, people started putting up ice houses. A large pit was dug in the ground and covered with a low building. The men filled the ice house with blocks of ice cut from the creek and placed layers of straw or sawdust on the ice. This ice was used for making ice cream, keeping food cool, such as meat and cream. The ice usually lasted until the cool weather arrived in the fall. In the wintertime, everyone traveled by horse and sleigh. In later years, they built closed-in cutters. It was so cold riding in these sleighs and cutters that rocks would be heated in the oven, wrapped in burlap sacks, and placed in the straw on the floorboards. Then you would pull a horse blanket over your knees, keeping your feet nice and warm. Catherine served the family meals on a long table in her kitchen. There was a long bench on each side of the table and a chair at either end. John always sat at the head of the table. Breakfast consisted of porridge, bread with butter, and homemade jam, usually rhubarb. The noon meal was the big meal of the day and consisted of sausage, potatoes, and noodles. The men came in from the fields and the family ate together. Sunday dinner was special. Supper was thick slices of Catherine's homemade bread, dipped in cream with plenty of coffee. Catherine was an accomplished cook and tried different recipes on her own. Every year she canned a vast amount of jam, fruit, vegetables, sauerkraut, rabbit meat, and chicken. Catherine milked the cows, fed the pigs and chickens, baked an endless supply of bread, and made sausages, head cheese, and butter. Milking time was a big chore that had to be done every morning and evening every day of the year. The cows had to be brought into the barn for milking. Each one had to be milked, and then the milk had to be put through a separator to separate the milk into cream and skim milk. The cream the family did not need was shipped by train to one of the dairies in Regina. Horses were used for field work and hauling grain into town. This was the kind of buggy my dad used when he was courting my mother. This is how the highway from Kronau to Regina was built. The horses are pulling Fresno scrapers. John and Catherine's family spoke German at home, and the children learned English when they attended school. All of John and Catherine's children attended this one-room school across the road from their farmyard. In the late 40s, this new school was built beside the old one. The dedication ceremonies were a big event in 14 Colony. John was a leader in the community. He was the secretary of the local telephone company, and he was on the boards of the church, the hall, and Catherine Tall School. Even though he only had a few months of schooling, he learned how to read and write and was an avid reader. John was a skilled blacksmith, and he built many things, including farm equipment, iron crosses, and wind chargers. He was very handy at making things that made life better and more convenient. He built a wind charger that charged the batteries to make electricity for lights and their radio. Each room of the house sported a single light bulb with a pull chain for turning it on and off. Not having to use kerosene lamps was a welcome improvement. John and Catherine were hard workers. Here they are planting potatoes. John is driving the 4 horses pulling the plow, making furrows in which the boys are dropping the potato seedlings. Catherine taught her children to be responsible by giving each child a job to do around the house and farm. Springtime meant it was time to plow and seed the fields. At first the work was done with horses, but later on tractors were used. This is my dad with a 4-horse team pulling a plow. Harvest time was supposed to be the payoff for all the hard work, but some years there was little or no reward. After 10 years of poor crop conditions, their land finally produced a few bumper crops in the 40s. Gathering the sheaves and keeping the thrashing machine stoked under the hot sun was extremely hard work. The grain was hauled to the elevators in Kronau. This is John on the hard-part tractor he was so proud of. By the late 1940s, thrashing was done with tractor-drawn combines instead of stationary thrashing machines. Catherine would make tons of delicious sandwiches, pie, and coffee for the hungry thrashing crew. She always packed the sandwiches in large tin containers, and I remember with great pleasure how I would finish the leftover sandwiches in the bottom of the containers. This 4-generation photo was taken in 1936. Catherine is on the left, her daughter Rose is in the middle with granddaughter Doris, and Catherine's mother Veronica is on the right. This is a photo of Catherine and her mother Veronica. Catherine's parents lived in Prelate, but the children loved to see them when they came to visit. This photo was taken in the summer of 1938. Behind John and Catherine are Anna Mary, Ignace, and Rosie with their youngsters. World War II began in 1939. Both Peter and Paul went overseas, and the entire family was greatly relieved when they returned home safely after the war was over. On Sunday mornings, winter and summer, John and Catherine's family would drive to 7 Colony for 10 o'clock Mass at St. Peter's Church. St. Peter's Church was built in 1903. All of their children were baptized, received First Holy Communion, and confirmation in the church. Many of the children were also married in this church. Every August, the Ell family would attend the grotto feast at 7 Colony. Construction had been started for the grotto on the southern slope of Many Bones Creek, north of the church, in June of 1917. During a 2-month period, Rastatt Colony was bustling with activity, young men gathering field stones with horses and wagons, stone masons hewing and laying the stones, women and young ladies mixing the mortar, with older people standing by and giving advice. The blessing and first pilgrimage were held on the 15th of August 1917. This was Kronau in 1948. It was about 3 miles from John and Catherine's farm. This is where they bought groceries, gasoline, delivered grain to the elevator, shipped cream to Regina by train, caught the train or picked up passengers who had arrived by train, and picked up their mail. Catherine and John would drive to Regina to shop. They would park at Market Square in downtown. All the local farm families would shop at the Army-Navy department store. The railing around the big wide staircase to the lower floor was a favorite meeting place. This is a photo of the annual farm exhibition in Regina. Some of you may remember listening to radio stations such as CHAB Moose Jaw and radio programs such as Ma Perkins, The Happy Gang, Amos and Andy, and country singers such as Wilf Carter and Gene Autry. You would also listen for the wheat board prices and reports about those in the hospital, but best of all was listening to the hockey games. This is John, daughter Veronica, and Catherine in front of his beloved McLaughlin Buick. Notice the chains on the rear wheels for driving on roads that were often muddy or covered in snow. After church on Sundays, the entire family would meet at John and Catherine's house, where she would serve a delicious Sunday dinner. After dinner, the adults would spend the afternoon visiting, sitting on chairs and benches around the kitchen, eating sunflower seeds from Catherine's garden. After Sunday dinner, there would be a big ball game across the road at the schoolyard. Everyone parked behind the backstop to protect their car windows from stray balls. Because you always wore your good clothes on Sundays, everyone played ball in their best clothes. On hot Sunday afternoons in summer, the younger family members cooled off in the old swimming hole at 14 Colony. The swimming hole was built by damming up the local creek. It had a mud and sand bottom, garter snakes, frogs, bulrushes, dragonflies, and muskrats. Sometimes you got the itch from swimming in it. On Sunday afternoons in the winter, the hockey enthusiasts would spend hours shoveling the snow off the frozen swimming hole and then spend the rest of the day playing hockey on it. This is how my dad would arrive for the big game. Beginning in 1933, the entire family became very busy planning and attending weddings. The first of John and Catherine's children to marry was Rose. She married Ben Del Schneider in February of 1933. Ignace married Catherine Harriff in October of 1935. Anna Mary married Meinrad Schmidt in May of 1937. And Paul married Teresa Bass in January of 1947. I remember it was a cold, crisp winter day as everyone rode to the church in horse-drawn sleighs. Peter married Irene Harriff in October of 47. Veronica married Fred Schaefer in November of 47. December of 1950 was a very sad time for Catherine and her family when John passed away suddenly on December the 8th, 1950, at the age of 60. He was laid to rest in the cemetery behind St. Peter's Church in 7 Colony. May he rest in peace. A few months after John's passing, Catherine moved to Regina with her children Frank, Emma, and Johnny. Soon thereafter, Adam and Joe purchased the family farm from Catherine. The 1950s produced a flurry of weddings. Joe married Florence Bertrand in July of 1953. Andy married Lorraine Fink in June of 1954. Adam married Jeanette Tobias in June of 1954. Johnny married Doreen Cattler in October of 1955. Frank married Ann Folk in October of 55. Emma married Joe Folk in 1956. After Joe's unfortunate passing in 1960, Emma married Mike Papp in August of 1962. In September of 63, at the age of 72, and after being a widow for 13 years, Catherine married a longtime acquaintance, Frank Overgabage. Catherine was now attending the weddings of her grandchildren. Visits with Sister Anne were infrequent, but always a very special time for the family. This is Catherine and Sister Anne and her brothers, about 1953, and this is Catherine and Sister Anne with her sisters. This is Catherine with her sisters Angie and Agnes, and this is Catherine in her kitchen. This photo of John and Catherine's 13 children was taken in the 1970s. Catherine's children made her a grandmother 63 times. Catherine passed away on her 85th birthday on January the 1st, 1976. She was a remarkable woman who I will always remember. She was laid to rest next to John at the cemetery behind St. Peter's Church. May she rest in peace.
Viel genug Arbeit. Ja, muss man immer schaffen, bis man klar von der umfällt. Dann kann man aufhören.
Roughly translated, what she said was, you just keep working until you fall over, and then you can quit.